Good morning, everyone. I am very excited to be appearing here today at VanLang University for the Heritech conference. I'm beaming in from Cornell University in the USA. My name is Dr. William Noseworthy, and I'm a visiting fellow at Cornell. My presentation will be on a social historian's perspective on heritage management in Southeast Asia. As we all know, heritage is all the rage in Southeast Asia today. The discourse on heritage and preservation, particularly as expressed through UNESCO, permeates our scholarship either as contemporary or historical observers. However, the question remains, how can we, as scholars of Southeast Asia, use these terms productively rather than passively to transmit neoliberal or functionalist interpretations of the past, its material remains in the present? Amid an apparent heritage rush, I will explore the historical and contemporary changes in who gets to decide what counts as heritage, what heritage means, and how we can think about preserving it to what end. Although my study and my research has been rooted in cases from Vietnam, I will also consider those from Thailand, Cambodia, Singapore, and Indonesia, and I should mention that these cases are inspired and often drawn from the work of colleagues of mine who presented a two-panel presentation on this subject at the Association of Asian Studies last year. As we begin here, we know that heritage management in Southeast Asia is often broken down into categories of interests. So scholars frequently consider the intersection between local, province and state actors, national or federal actors, and international and global actors. As I mentioned at the outset, the possible cases that I will be considering are those from Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Singapore, and I will sort of progress through those cases in order. In the case of Thailand, especially in the city of Chiang Mai, in northern Thailand, scholars have examined the power of heritage discourse, both globally, thinking about Lowenthal, Mesco, and Askew here, as well as in Asia, thinking about scholars like Pekam et al., Ludwig et al. And they've looked at different groups using the physical remains of the past to define or defy political authority, to create or capture economic benefits, and to reify or revise history. In present-day illiberal Thailand, events like the 2018 eviction of Pom community highlight the divide between central Thai and local views on urban heritage. So we might look to the work of Dr. Taylor Esom, who is a good friend and colleague of mine, who has placed events like this, and particularly the ongoing application of Chiang Mai for the inclusion of UNESCO's World Heritage List, in a historical context by examining the history behind changing attitudes towards heritage spaces over the long 20th century, especially in the case of Thailand, looking at royal palaces and city walls. The case in Chiang Mai is the old city walls pictured here in this slide. While Bangkok elites projected the twin goals of urban improvement and economic development on their own city walls, Dr. Taylor Esom has argued in northern cities, walls also became symbols of a romanticized past. Likewise, while palaces in Bangkok became symbols of this modernization process and the modernization of the monarchy, royal residences in northern Thailand associated with the former kingdom of Lanna have been a more sort of complicated manner. So there's this sense that there's contestations between a center and a periphery sort of society, a local or a provincial or a past kingdom, as well as a central authority in this case. And I just want to point out here for folks who are not familiar with the history of Thailand that all of these dynamics are rooted in the memory of the Lana kingdom, also known as Lana Thai, and most commonly called Lana. This is an Indianized state that was centered in present-day northern Thailand from the 13th through the 18th centuries. The cultural development of the northern Thai people as distinct, however, begins long before, as successive kingdoms tend to be viewed as predecessors to Lana. As a continuation of the previous kingdoms, Lana emerges strong enough in the 15th century to rival the central Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya, and there were even wars between Lana and Ayutthaya. However, the Lana kingdom is weakened and becomes a tributary state of the Burmese Tuangu dynasty in 1558. Lana is then ruled by a successive series of vassal kings, although they enjoy some autonomy. By the time we get up to about 1775, Lana chiefs and these vassal kings had left the sphere of Burmese control to join Siam during the course of the Burmese-Siamese War of 1775 to 1776. Then, following the retreat of Burmese forces, Burmese control of Lana comes to an end, and it's really only under King Taksin of the Thonburi Kingdom that Siam gains control of this northern Thai area. However, there's a process of incorporation. From the 18th century through the 20th century, Lana is still enjoying some amount of local autonomy. Lana had been a tributary state from 1776 of Siam under the succeeding Shakri dynasty after the Thonburi Kingdom, though throughout the latter half of the 1800s, Siam is really engaged in this process of dismantling Lana's independence and absorbing it into the modern Siamese sort of nation state, and thus modern Thailand. By 1909, the Lana Kingdom no longer existed formally as an independent state, so it's really only in the 20th century that we see Lana Kingdom as incorporated completely into the state of Siam. Thus, these contestations over the walls and the city walls and the question of whose heritage they are is rooted in this history. Now, some folks might know that I've worked with a couple of VanLang's faculty, especially Wang Dai Duin, on heritage sites in Vietnam, especially Champa and Cham heritage sites. Most recently, Wang Dai Duin and I have detailed the perception of indigenous Cham communities in Vietnam with regard to the concept of authenticity located at the Po Klong Garai Temple complex in Ninh Thuan province, based on a combination of historical and anthropological methods, including a series of interviews that we have collected and sometimes conducted with our members of our team or incorporated from other scholars who are colleagues of ours who are working in the field of Cham studies, basically from the range of about 2011 through 2018, 19, and even up into most recently 2020, we've found government officials, Vietnamese government officials, have imposed their own concepts of authenticity on indigenous heritage sites in Vietnam, favoring tourist development over local religious values of the site. So we looked at the symbolic use of joss stick incense, which is considered taboo in Cham culture, but is allowed for tourists at these sites per decisions that have been sort of green-lighted by local Vietnamese government officials. Needless to say, members of the Cham community have been distraught by the practice because it's considered taboo to burn joss stick incense as opposed to traditional Cham incense, which would be called galao or eagle's wood or aloe wood. Now, in contrast with the experience of locals in reference to the Po Klong Garai site in Vietnam, where you have the Panduranga Kingdom, which is only incorporated into the Empire of the Vietnamese in the 1830s, and the Lana Kingdom, which is only incorporated into Siam in 1909, I want to spend a moment and focus on a national heritage site, Angkor. Everyone should recognize this example. The extensive collection of sites and communities which is strewn across the Angkor World Heritage Area has become an enchanting location for the entire global community. There is a vast number of countries and intergovernmental groups and international teams that have contributed to the conservation, the restoration, the research, and the sustainable development of projects to quote-unquote save Angkor. Here, as my friend and colleague Dr. Sarah Kim Holma has pointed out, there are varied interests at play. Private investors, international agencies under UNESCO's ICC Angkor umbrella, and the local here being National Cambodian, Apsara National Authority, have gently concealed an imbalance of financial capacity and technical capacity on the ground. So financial capacity is greater for the international teams and technical capacity is greater for the international teams. So this leads to imbalanced dynamics on the ground. Sustained foreign investment in the Angkor World Heritage Area has built basically a cycle wherein the Cambodian state is dependent on the tourism to these sites to support the local economy. This becomes a problem, of course, if we are to have major events that interrupt this source of income, such as a global pandemic, for example. In the case of Indonesia, we also see a heritage rush as governments and organizations identify ever more structures and monuments as possessing culturally significant power. Many are associated with Dutch colonial rule in the archipelago, however. I could have easily brought up the example of Borobudur, which also has its own colonial era dynamics wrapped up into the transformation of that site into a tourist site, but there are also Dutch colonial sites, Dutch colonial era sites, such as this fort that is pictured on this slide, that are wrapped up into the tourist industry as well. Much effort to preserve colonial era structures also comes from activism of local civil society and groups of young Indonesians. So we could look at sites in Semarang as examples of locations where digital ethnography has become prominent in the preservation of the site. As my colleague Dr. Lauren Yap has argued, there's a growing interest in colonial era sites as heritage, although this raises questions about what counts as heritage in the post-Reformasi period in Indonesia. So what happens to colonial associations of these sites when they are newly coded as part of Indonesian heritage? How does Indonesia's colonial past become hidden or highlighted in the process? The slide here is showing you an image of Fort Rotterdam, which is a fort in Makassar on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. It's a Dutch fort built on top of an existing fort of the Goa Kingdom. So there's two forts here at play, the Goa Kingdom Heritage Fort and the Dutch Colonial Heritage Fort, both of which are being reimagined and reincorporated into the national heritage of Indonesia. The first fort on the site was constructed by a local sultan around 1634 to counter Dutch encroachments. The site was then ceded to the Dutch under the Treaty of Bongaya, and they completely rebuilt the fort in 1673 and 1679. The fort is now used to hold various cultural events. There's a conservatory for music and dance, where you could see local music and dance being put on display, not Dutch music and dance. And you could see an archive of the city. And there's also a historic and archaeological institute in the site. So we're seeing this site remade as part of Indonesian history. In the final example here, my colleague Dr. Michelle Lim has done an excellent job to examine how artists have integrated national and historic memories in artworks that involve national monuments in Singapore, especially the Merlion, but also those of the British East India Administrator, Sir Stamford Raffles. In recent years, there's been quite a bit of repudiation of Raffles as the founder of modern Singapore, as well as the histories of colonial violence, discrimination, and atrocities that occurred here under British colonial rule. The statue of Raffles in a conqueror's stance, which was installed only in 1969, came under critical scrutiny recently by local artists. The Merlion, on the other hand, has been transformed into this image of a fantastic creature with a lion's head and the fishtail that began its life in Singapore tourism as a sort of mascot in the 1960s, but has transformed into a much broader image that's been portrayed as a smiling beast, incorporated on all types of souvenirs, from plush toys to keychains to, yes, even lighters for smokers. And I will confess, I have a Merlion lighter. So it is true that people who are visiting Singapore will pick this up, and you can see the statue of Raffles on the one hand in contrast with the image of the Merlion on the other hand. Even though they're both put up in the 1960s, they're both created as memories of the colonial era, and they're both being critically reinterpreted by artists, including Lee Wen's Artists Investigating Monuments Raffles in 2000, which summarizes quite a lot of this critical examination. So the question for us becomes, what is going on in a summary of these sites? So as I pointed out at the outset, in the case of heritage management in Southeast Asia, scholars are frequently considering the dynamics between local, provincial and state, national and federal, and international and global actors. And the question here becomes, what is meant by local? That's the critical question. Who is local and why? In the case of Poklonggarai, is it that the Cham are considered local, or for some uninformed foreign tourists, might they accidentally consider the Vietnamese the local controllers of the site, right, or the local owners of that heritage? In the case of the city walls in Chiang Mai, is it the locals who are considered, from their own perspectives, descendants of the Lana kingdom, or is it those central Thai, or is it all Thai, or is it the entire global community if it's a World Heritage Site? So I just want to underscore that it is important for us to consider not just the local, province, national, international, and global dynamics of these, but also the dynamics of internal minority and majority relationships within the region of Southeast Asia, and especially pay close attention to the values of indigenous communities and the construction of indigeneity within the context of heritage management today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.